Hello, everyone. Welcome to the It Hurts to Mom podcast. I'm Lauren Rose, and today's guest is Rosemary Clark. After burning out at work, Rose learned in therapy that she had a highly abusive childhood. Her need to push herself so hard was rooted in trying to earn something that seemed out of reach her whole life, feeling her parents' love. When Rose became a mom, it magnified her insecurities and started triggering unshed tears and unexpressed anger. She felt she had two choices: fall into the abyss of repeating what her parents did, or learn completely new ways of relating. Rose will forever be grateful that she stumbled upon language of listening, a parenting model that not only allowed her to become the mom she always wanted to be, but also allowed her to reparent herself. Now, as an authorized language of listening coach, she specializes in helping moms who had difficult childhoods and gets them into a place where they love the way they parent. She also suffers from chronic pain due to long haul COVID. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Tell us a little bit. Let's start with the chronic pain aspect. Let's, kind of talk about how you develop chronic pain and what you deal with and how long you've dealt with it, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned in the intro long haul COVID, but really I guess my journey with chronic pain started before that. It really started with a ton of inflammation. And that really started to show itself in my first pregnancy. At the very beginning of my first pregnancy, I actually, my thyroid went off the rocks, and actually almost lost the baby as a result of that. Thankfully, I had some good medical care at the time. And it was later that I found out that, really what was causing it was this Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease. And so after a number of years of having that and really not getting the kind of care that I needed for the autoimmune side of it, that inflammation in my body kept getting greater and greater to the point where I was having this chronic kind of lower right quadrant pain. And, went to many doctors, had many tests. There was 3 different types of cancer that were thrown around that I had to get tested for over the span of a year. And finally, that last test that I had was a colonoscopy. And at the end of that, because the doctor didn't find anything, what I was left with was the comment, some women just have unexplained abdominal pain.
Oh,
That's
lovely.
what I was left with, after over a year of constant pain, in my body that I was dealing with. And, so there's always been kind of some version of that pain going on. And then when I contracted COVID in November of 2021, I did also end up with long haul COVID. And there's definitely been some, pain that has added itself to my to my inflammation, and the pain going on mostly kind of gallbladder area, which I'm learning is definitely can be kind of a side effect of COVID, or, something lovely that gets left behind after that illness. So that's my chronic pain.
Yeah, everybody's got their own chronic pain story. I think it's interesting. It started with kind of autoimmune disease because I've got autoimmune disease as well. They think it's rheumatoid arthritis, but I've had some thyroid issues as well, and there just aren't good answers, is what I found.
There aren't. You're right. Yep.
So I want to talk to you about a couple of big topics. The first one we mentioned in your bio, the language of listening. What is that, and how did you get into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, being a mom and trying to parent when you are very low energy because your thyroid's not getting treated properly, starting to have consistent pain, that was added on top of having had a very difficult abusive childhood. And if you look into the studies, the scientific studies and stuff, you can look into, for example, the adverse childhood experience studies. You can find that, a lot of times what they've been able to do is actually link adverse childhood experiences to later on in your life developing autoimmune disease. So that was a real connection for me that I was made later in my life. But I knew that I wanted to parent differently than the way I was parented because, yes, my childhood was traumatic as a result of the way that I was parented. And I thought that just making that decision was all I would need. But when I had 2 kids under 2 and I started yelling at them, I knew that something was terribly wrong. So I started to look for tools. I said to my husband, I had these great ideas, but I don't have the tools. I wonder if the tools that I even would want exist, And the things I was really looking for were things that I talked to him about before we even got married, which was, because I wanted to make sure that he wanted to parent similarly to me, And so I just mentioned that idea of I really want our children to be able to be their own unique selves. They don't have to be like us. I want them to be allowed to have their own thoughts, feelings, and opinions, because that's one of the things that I felt was missing from my own childhood. And I also wanted our kids to have close emotional attachment with their parents. Again, something that was missing from my own childhood. But under the circumstances, I wasn't able to provide that for my kids. So I started looking for tools, started reading all the books and all the blog posts. And things would work for a couple days, but nothing would really stick until I stumbled on language of listening. And the two big pieces of language of listening that really struck me were, one, that they allowed me to really see my child for who they are and draw their strengths out to the surface. So really acknowledging like who they are as a unique individual and drawing, all those good parts out to the surface, which was really important for me, as I stated before. But then there was this other piece there that was so almost magical for me, which was like, it taught me how to hold boundaries in a way that left both me and my child feeling empowered. And I didn't know that was possible. I thought boundaries were just about controlling other people, usually having to be mean to do it. That was my experience. That's how my brain got wired. It's the only thing I knew. And so this parenting model taught me that actually you can hold boundaries in a way that like feel really good and feel really healthy and actually help the relationship feel closer than it did before you had to hold the boundary. And that was hugely important for me. And so I mean, that's it. Language of listening, it's a parenting model based on something called child parent relationship therapy. And the founder, Sandra Blackbird, was able to take child parent relationship therapy but also pull in transformational coaching, positive psychology, and really distill it down to something really simple. It's 3 simple tools. And there's premises to go with each one of those tools, like new beliefs that really help us in the way that we parent and the way that we see the world and the way that we see ourselves. And that is huge and worked very well for my autoimmune brain, which, tends to have brain fog for a little while. Tends to have brain fog from time to time. Just only having to remember these 3 simple tools really helped me, a lot as a mom and as a mom with autoimmune disease. Yeah.
No, that's really cool. There are a few things I want to touch on here. We'll get to boundaries in just a couple of minutes. But have you ever heard the statistic that like 50 to 80% of our physical pain, like for people who have chronic pain, is due to emotional pain? I've seen the statistic 50. I've seen the statistic 80%.
I haven't seen statistics per se, but yes, like I know what you're talking about because like somatics, I guess, is kind of the way that I understand it, the way that our emotions can get trapped in our body. And absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I think that's interesting when you when you were talking about how, abusive childhood can lead to autoimmune disease in a lot of people. So it made me think of that statistic that trauma and abuse and things like that can lead to chronic physical pain in people as well.
Absolutely. Yep.
So on the language of listening, like what are the benefits of this model?
Yeah, well, I think it's really cool because I really feel like the founder was able to crack the code on how human beings work, but through the lens of parenting. So we have this wonderful, very easy to fall back on, very, just effective parenting model. But again, she's really cracked the code on how human beings work. And so, my husband's a therapist and he'll tell you that our marriage is better as a result of language of listening. I was able to use language of listening to reparent myself. When she started teaching us how to use the tools with ourselves, same 3 tools. I use the same 3 tools with my husband that I use with my kids, that I use with myself, that I used with, customers when my husband and I were running a retail shop. We don't do that anymore, but when we did, I had language of listening at that time. And so, I mean, for me personally, the biggest 2 pieces were really being able to use the tools to reparent myself, but then also to use those tools to become the kind of mom that I always wanted to be, because it's such an important part of my identity. It's such an important part of, what I'm doing in the world, is parenting my children. And so to be able to do it in a way that I love, that I feel really proud of myself, that's huge for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I read a lot of, parenting books and blogs and articles and things like that because I want to be the best mom that I can be. And, I tell my daughter all the time, like, I know I'm not perfect, but she tells me all the time that I'm a great mom.
Yeah.
And she's 11, she's a tween, she's got these hormones that are starting up, but I love that she tells me that, and I love that she can see that I really do my best. So I'm a big proponent of like positive parenting and things like that, you don't punish your kids with blame, shame, or pain. You give them consequences to help them change their behaviors and things like that. So I really am interested in this. I'm going to go look it up and see what else I can learn. Do you think there's any disadvantages of this parenting model?
I certainly haven't experienced any. No,
Okay.
it's been absolutely life changing for me and for my children too. You know, it's so amazing. And one of my favorite things is with my own kids or with the children of the clients that I work with, when we start to hear the children using that language themselves in their relationships and in regards to themselves, that's one of my favorite pieces. You know, like my self-talk is junk after the childhood that I have. And, you know, it's gotten a lot better over the years. But, you know, I had a client, for example, who told me that her daughter came to her and used like exact language of listening wording. And it's this is the way this girl speaks to herself. And she very simply used two of the tools, which is say what you see and then naming the strength. And she said, Mom, I cleaned my desk. That shows I'm responsible. And like to know that this little girl thinks about herself that way, because usually it's the other way around, isn't it? Usually it's
Mm,
like I tripped and fell. I'm such an idiot. I'm such a klutz. Like we blame ourselves. You talked about not using blame and shame and punishment in parenting. And when we do those things, when we include those things in our parenting, this is teaching our child how to treat themselves. You know, and so when you're leaving those parts out of parenting, and of course we have to fill in that void with other things, right? Which is what,
yeah.
you know, you and I have both been doing is filling in those voids with other things. You know, it really we really do teach our children how to view themselves, how to judge themselves, how to speak to themselves. And you know, I think that's just so important to recognize. Yeah.
It sounds like just since you talk about the three tools, it sounds like it's pretty easy to implement program.
Yeah, it is. I mean, parenting is tricky. Don't get me wrong, right? Parenting is
Yeah.
tricky. And once we start dealing with those surface level issues, we start using the tools and start dealing with the surface level issues, our children are then able to bring the deeper issues that they have, the deeper challenges, really, because we're all hitting up against challenges. We're all here to, you know, continue our growth. And kids, you know, there's tons of life skills that we need to pass on to them. And so this is how their challenges usually show up is, you know, they're at a new stage of development. They need some new life skills. Their behavior can start to get a little, you know, off the rails or a little bit irritating or whatever it is. And then, you know, to be able to jump in there and support them, you know, through the different stages. So it's easy in the sense the tools are, you know, easy to know how to use and easy to remember.
Hmm.
And then we do have to keep on learning how to take them deeper, and we grow right along with our children. It's really beautiful.
Sure. No, I love that. I think that parents should grow and change and mature just as, I mean, we're people. So there's always room for growth and improvement. And that's one of my core values is like personal growth. I think that's really important for me as a person and as a mom and as a wife and just as a human being, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned, the two big things that you saw from language of listening. One was, seeing your child for who they are, their individuality. And you talked about how, you want your children to have their own opinions and thoughts and ideas, and that you didn't have that. I didn't have that either. My dad was just very black and white. If you didn't agree with him, you were just dumb. You just illogical. You didn't know what you were talking about. And I've found that a lot of people had that. Like, even with like emotions, like I wasn't allowed to be anything but happy. If I was sad or angry, my dad would tell me, "You're just a child. You have no reason to be sad," or "You're just a child. You have no reason to be angry," or "You're just a child. You don't. Your opinion is wrong." And he told me that even when I was like 16, like, "You're just a child, so you don't know what you're talking about." And so, but I found that just in talking to people through this podcast, that that's fairly common, like with the generation I grew up in. I thought it was just a me thing, so even now, like for the longest time, I had trouble like realizing what my opinions even were, and sometimes I still do. Like, I'm very
Yes.
on the fence about so many things. I'm kind of
Yes.
wishy-washy. Like, I can see both sides, and I'm like, I don't know. And even like the simple question, well, what do you want to have for dinner? Well, a lot of times I just don't know what my preference is because I wasn't given that opportunity to have that space.
Absolutely. 100%. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then the second thing you talked about was boundaries. So that's the big thing I want to talk about today. I think language of listening is a really interesting concept. I'm definitely going to go and look more into. But let's talk about boundaries now, because I love this topic. So, from like, a lot of people think that boundaries are rules that you set for other people to change their behavior. Like, I'm not going to tolerate you, like you can't watch XYZ on TV. But it's completely the opposite, right? It's like limits you set for yourself to protect your well-being, things that you are and are not going to put up with. So, like, tell me what your kind of definition of a boundary is? Let's start there.
So there, oh goodness. Well, I mean, according to language of listening and what I've learned is that, your boundaries are just your preferences. And it's interesting what you said, like
Mm,
rules and boundaries are different things. They are different things. Boundaries exist inside of you. They're deeply connected to your identity, to your authentic self. And that's different than a rule, right? A rule is like expressing for somebody else how they can respect you by respecting your boundaries. So they're
mm,
different things. They're definitely different things. Yep. But yeah, your boundaries are really just they're your authentic self showing up in the world. That's what they
mm.
are. Yep.
I never thought about it like that, but I like that concept of it because when I'm thinking about the boundaries that I set, it really is about what preferences I have and how I want to be treated and what I'm going to allow myself to put up with. I've heard the saying, you teach people how to treat you. And I
I've heard
think
that.
that
Yes.
boundaries have a lot to do with that. When you set them, you're teaching people, okay, you may act this way, but here's how I'm going to respond in return. So if you're watching this TV show that I don't like, I can't control what you're doing because we can't control other people. And it's not about controlling other people, it's about ourselves, right? So it's like if you're watching this TV show that I disagree with or I don't like or I don't think is appropriate, I'm going to leave the room, for instance, or I'm going to go on a walk, or I'm just not going to expose myself to it or be there for it. One thing that I think people have a lot of problems with, and I certainly did when I started implementing boundaries, is actually keeping the boundaries. So I would set a boundary. I wouldn't always tell the people what my boundary was. Sometimes I would, and sometimes I wouldn't. Um, and I guess we could get into if that's appropriate or not. But I had trouble actually keeping my own boundaries. Why do you think that is, and what can we do about that?
Yeah. Okay. I feel like there's so much for us to talk about,
I
and I can
know.
just like totally connect all of the things that you've been talking about, even when you began with like, your dad really being invalidating of like who you were, what your thoughts and feelings and opinions were. And the fact that you are not sure what your own opinions are at this stage. And then even this idea of holding boundaries and not like, let's just dive into all of it because it's all absolutely connected. So one thing I would say too about what you were saying about boundaries, because there's somewhat of a difference between the boundaries that you hold, not a huge difference, but somewhat, the boundaries that you hold with another adult and the boundaries that you hold with your children. And because with our children, if they are watching a TV show that we're not okay with them watching, right, that is a point where we are going to move in and act and do something to protect the child, right? So when we're thinking about
Sure.
boundaries when it comes to kids, we can think love and protection. That's really
Hmm.
what it's all about, is love and protection. But let's go back to our own childhoods now and being, basically invalidated, right? Like just saying like, like, there's no value to like what you're thinking and saying and feeling and all those things. So what ends up happening, for so many of us, we were raised in that kind of reward and punishment, paradigm, that model. And what ends up happening is those preferences that we talked about, those boundaries that are connected to our authentic selves, they get moved off to the side. We lose access. We stop really paying attention to them. Instead, we set our radar to be really, really sensitive to the preferences of the people around us, right?
Hmm.
Typically our parents, right? And this is one of the ways that we maintain connection with them. And why do we maintain connection with our parents? Well, yes, it has a lot to do with loving them, but really it comes down to life and death. The people
Hmm.
that are responsible for our survival when we're children, we become very attached to them for that reason, for survival. Hopefully we can be attached, emotionally as well. Because there's a lot of love there, but sometimes it's difficult and to feel that side of it, right? Especially when our emotions are being denied us, really. And so that idea of the fact that we've lost that connection to our authentic selves, it becomes really, really important. I felt the exact same as you did, Lauren. I felt like I know what what all the different authorities' opinions are about this specific situation, but I don't know myself in this situation. I don't know what I actually think and how I actually feel. And that was part of the reparenting that I was able to do with myself using the tools from language of listening, which was so incredibly helpful. And so, again, when it comes back to our boundaries, there are two really important pieces when it comes to boundaries. One is you need to know how to identify your boundaries. So you and I have both experienced it, and you're saying other people you've spoken to, we don't really know what our boundaries are. And so the first thing that I do with my clients that I learned from language of listening is I actually get my clients to sit down and take 20 to 30 minutes. And all of your listeners, you can do this, your listeners, everybody can do this. Sit down, get 20 to 30 minutes on your own, and just start to make a list of everything that you can think of that you like and everything that you can think of that you dislike. and start to just draw an awareness. So that first being able to identify, it really is about likes and dislikes. But again, sometimes our brain just goes to, well, like, I know what my mom would dislike in this moment. And I focus on that, because if I'm not aware of that, there might be some abuse coming my way, right? So it's that life or death piece, right? So it's starting to be able to let go of that life or death piece, because we do not need those people for our survival anymore. And I'm speaking to the people that had abusive childhoods now, right? You don't need those people for survival anymore. You are capable, and you can choose who you resource now. You can choose who you're in relationship with. You can choose who you support, who's going to support you back. And so being able to create that list, again, that awareness is so important. But the other piece is learning how to honor your likes and dislikes. And that's what you were saying about, like, well, sometimes I don't always hold my boundaries, right? And so for me, I found, especially in my 20s, oh my goodness, and especially when it came to like romantic relationships, it was always like, try to hold a boundary. But there was always a question attached to my boundary, which was, if that's okay with you. This is who I am, if that's okay with you. I'm like, that is not creating a healthy relationship at all, right? And then if that person didn't like my boundary or whatever, I would quickly throw it away. I would just be done with that connection, that honoring of that part of myself. And that really was a problem for a lot of reasons. And I wouldn't be surprised if that was part of, me developing autoimmune disease, was this complete, stuffing down of who I am constantly, time and time again, my emotions, my authentic self, all those things. Because in a lot of ways, that caused me to stop listening to the messages that my body was sending me. Right. And part of that comes because some of the abuse I experienced in my childhood was physical abuse. But I believe it also comes partially from the emotional abuse as well. Both of those pieces, that idea of not trusting myself. This is why, I think one of the most important things that I can pass on to my children, to my clients, and I've worked on with myself, is something called unconditional self-trust. When we can unconditionally trust ourselves, when we can have no drama around what we like and what we dislike, and just know, this is me and I accept myself. The sky is blue, it just is. We can't change that. Sometimes it's cloudy, but even that's out of our control. We can go indoors and close all the windows and get away from the sky if we want to, right? But the sky is just always going to be blue. And so, like, the first thing I wrote on my likes and dislikes list, the first thing I wrote was, like, I love red licorice, because you can do love and hate if you like, too. I love red licorice. I just do. Nobody can convince me that red licorice is disgusting. I know it's not very good for me. It's not something I eat. Actually, I haven't had it for a long time, because when you have thyroid disease, it's good to stay away from gluten, and there's tons of gluten in licorice. But like, you can't convince me it's disgusting. You could convince me that you think it's disgusting, right? And when I'm okay with my own likes and dislikes, and this is one of the reasons why language of listening has been so good for my marriage, actually. I got really okay with my own likes and dislikes, which made me kind of this whole person, right? With connection to my authentic self. But then it also allowed me to let my husband have his own likes and dislikes, and not take them personally, and not be offended by them, and just go, oh, that's just who he is. And I love him, and it's just who he is. And he gets to have his own likes and dislikes, and I get to have my own likes and dislikes too. And that's great. And then we can actually have a much clearer conversation. It's actually that idea of having those things, your likes and dislikes, your preferences, your emotions, all mixed up together. That's a sign of enmeshment. And enmeshment is not a healthy part of a relationship. Some people might call it codependency. Codependency usually has more to do with, when you're dealing with a relationship where there's some addiction involved. But enmeshment is when, my emotions are caused by your emotions, and, and my emotions cause you to do these certain things. And it's like, no, that's like being trapped in a spider web. That's not a real relationship. And there's actually a lack of closeness in those relationships, and that enmeshment. So again, that's how language of listening really helped my marriage in a big way. One of the ways was really being able to say, here I am, I'm this whole person over here with my likes and dislikes, with my boundaries. Right? And the other really important thing to know about boundaries is the way the other person responds really has a lot to do with how we feel about our boundary, because we pick up on other people's emotions, and other people pick up on our emotions. And it's all kind of a subconscious thing. We have these mirror neurons in our brain that really cause us to pick up on how other people are feeling. But I really believe it's connected to our nervous system as well. That we're meant to live in community, that we're meant to experience emotions together. And that's a really powerful part of being human. And when we're holding boundaries, if we come with fear, if we come with questions, if we come with anger and frustration, those emotions, the other people around us that we're trying to talk to our boundaries about, they're going to pick up on those emotions and not know why. So they're going to feel afraid of your boundaries. They're going to be afraid that you're trying to control them. They're going to feel angry and frustrated, right? So you're going to get that back. But when we can be really clear about our boundaries because we know what they are, and when we have no drama around holding them, you just can't watch this TV show. I just can't let you watch this TV show because I love you too much and I want to protect you, right? Coming to speak to your child about a boundary when that's how you feel, not I'm so angry you can't watch this show. How could you? Right? That comes from the fear, that comes from that life or death that we experienced in our childhood about lack of connection, and that, boundaries equal lack of connection. They did in my childhood anyways, right? So to be able to learn how to hold boundaries in a way that I knew I was actually loving and protecting my children meant we could have a conversation, meant that they felt loved and protected when I said, let's turn off this TV show. And they also feel loved and protected because if they don't like the fact that you're turning their TV show off, you're free to acknowledge that and work through that and acknowledge who they are, acknowledge their authentic self in that moment. So there, I just threw tons of information there at you about boundaries and about, that idea of it being difficult to hold them. So kind of coming at it from some different angles there about here's some ways that you can really pay attention to identifying and honoring your boundaries. And that's really what helps us be able to hold them more consistently.
Was there a certain point in your life, or was it through like language of listening, where you came out of the like you said, when in your 20s, like especially in romantic relationships, it was hard to hold those boundaries. So what kind of got you to the point where you could maintain those boundaries and feel confident about it?
Yeah, it was language of listening. It was really getting to know my likes and dislikes and honoring them. So I can offer another activity that people can do. It's kind of the next step after you've got your list, that can start to rewire your brain. Because again, remember I talked about our radar being really sensitive to other people's likes and dislikes? And that's really bringing other people's identity into our experience of life, right? And we need to experience life through our own authentic identity, through who we truly are. And so our brain gets wired. Again, it's that radar that we have that gets really focused in. So what we want to do is kind of rewire the brain and shift that radar over to being sensitive about what's going on inside our bodies, because our body really does send us so many messages. And our heart sends us a lot of messages too, And so that idea of once you've got your likes and dislikes list, something that's really powerful is to go throughout your day and notice when something happens that you have a strong reaction to. And just stop for a second and think about and notice to yourself whether you like or dislike it. So it could just simply be that you're smiling. It could be that your body wants to do a happy dance. It could be that you feel like crying. It could be that you feel like yelling. It could be that you have a headache or your stomach is all tight. All those things can be a message. And if we just stop and go, so the example I'd like to use is say that you had this glass that, you knocked on the floor and it broke. And so what I teach people to do in that moment, because, you're probably going to have a reaction to it, even jumping back is a reaction, right? And so in that moment, we use that first tool from language of listening, which is say what you see. So, you just say what you saw, right? And so and you don't blame yourself for that glass falling on the floor either, even if you're the one that knocked it on the floor, right? You just say a glass fell on the floor and it broke. You keep it really objective. A glass fell on the floor and it broke. And then you ask yourself, like, did you like that or did you not like that? Right? So usually it's going to be a glass fell on the floor and it broke and you didn't like that. And we really use that word you when we're using the tools with ourselves. It's as if we're this outside observer. It's very validating. And you say, and you didn't like that. Simple as that. And that just starts to get your brain wired to start to pay attention to what you like and what you dislike. And I like to use this example, Lauren, because maybe this was a really ugly yellow glass that you thought was so just really gross looking, and every time you looked at it, it reminded you of crabby old Aunt Martha, because she gave it to you and she told you, like, this glass is so important and you have to protect it with your life, and you could never give it away, and you hated seeing it every time you saw it, and it's just an accident. It just fell on the floor and it broke. And so maybe your reaction is going to be a glass fell on the floor and it broke, and you liked that. You like that happened, because now you don't have to have this reminder of crabby old Aunt Martha, right? And how controlling she tried to be over this glass that she told you had to love when you just don't love it, And so, it's okay. It's okay that you like that the glass broke. It's just your authentic self showing up. It's just your experience.
Yeah, that's interesting that a broken glass, you would immediately think, you know, that you wouldn't like that, but there could be something different if you actually acknowledge, your authentic self, like you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. and to start to have no drama, to
Mm.
start that idea of accepting yourself, that self-acceptance, again, that unconditional self-trust, right? It's so, so important.
One thing I think is really important also is setting boundaries when you have chronic pain and chronic illness.
Oh, yes.
So, what are some good boundaries for people with those issues, do you think?
Yeah, it's funny because as you're talking about that, what really pops into my head is how much I started to recognize in my life that I was crossing over my own boundaries, that it wasn't about other people crossing my boundaries, that it was about me crossing my own boundaries. So, one of the things that I really had to learn with chronic illness, and especially with this long haul COVID, I mean, that darn thing would not budge. I was sick for
Mhm.
18 months where I could barely get out of bed. I couldn't walk around the block without having to lay in bed for 3 days. And what really started to change it was when I decided to start actually listening to the messages that my body was sending instead of trying to push myself too hard. And I think one of the really important things that we need to be okay with and accept when it comes to chronic pain is that maybe we have less capacity than other people have. Or really, what it's about is we have less capacity either than we used to have, or really, it's less capacity than we wish we had. We really wish we could have more capacity. And sometimes we just consistently keep pushing ourselves through that. And what I found myself with my own chronic illness is that if I keep on pushing myself beyond my boundaries, beyond my capacity, I don't get better. I have
Mhm.
worse days. I get flare ups, right? And so that idea of being able to recognize, identify your boundaries, recognize your capacity, right? And then know how to honor it as well without any drama, right? So it's really hard. I think it's especially hard for women. And again, if we go back to the science, we see that autoimmune disease affects more women than it affects men. There are many reasons for that. And I think one of them, though, is that we really do we've been taught to not pay attention, to not honor our capacity, and
Mhm.
it's a hard lesson to learn. It's a very hard lesson to learn, but I think it's one of the most important lessons that we can learn. So that idea of paying attention to when you're crossing your own boundaries, when you're pushing past your own capacity, and there are times when it's okay to push past your capacity. There are times when that's okay. But what you want to do is you want to go back and check in with your body, and you want to go back and you want to check in with really, really, what's the capacity here? And am I okay with in crossing it in this moment? And why am I okay? Usually I was okay with crossing my own capacity because I was just taught to do that in my childhood and it felt safer. For me,
Mhm.
pushing past my capacity was creating safety for myself, because in my mind, it was going to gain my acceptance from my mother, that my mother would finally love me, that my mother would finally accept me. And I ended up having a conversation with myself one day where I was just like, I had to talk to that kind of part of myself and just be like, listen, I know you're pushing yourself really hard right now because you think it's going to make, our mom like us. And she just doesn't really like us all that much. It's just the
Mhm.
reality. Unfortunately, she thinks it's unsafe to tell you that you're acceptable because she thinks that means that you're going to stop growing, and she thinks that means that it's dangerous for you to accept yourself. That's my mom's belief. I came to understand that. And when I was able to let go of pushing myself to try to get my mom's love, to try to earn my mom's love, this was like at 36, 37 years old. Like, come on. By that point, right, I should be able to, exist on my own. And now the truth is, we never want our parents, like, we never stop wanting our parents to love us. That's just not a thing that happens, right? We'd always like our parents' love, but our parents cannot always give us the love that we actually need, and that we needed in our childhood. And so learning to not push myself past my capacity for the sake of trying to get my mom to like me, like understanding, like, why am I doing this thing? And let's go back to the likes and dislikes. Do I like the way that I'm trying to get this thing? These are questions we can ask ourselves, especially in these moments of chronic illness when we're trying to push past our capacity. What is my goal in this moment? What am I actually trying to, accomplish? And then do I actually want to accomplish this thing? So I realized I actually didn't want to keep trying to get my mom to like me because it was like an impossible task. But also, like, and if you are okay with that task, that goal that you're trying to get to, do you like the way you're getting there? Ask yourself,
Mhm.
right? Because another thing that's really important for us to pay attention to is when it's okay to have, a certain capacity and stop when we get to that point of capacity. That's when it's okay for us to solve the problem, right? And the way I usually say is, when it's okay to have a problem, it's okay to solve it. When it's okay to have a certain capacity, it's okay to live from that capacity and ask for help. or leave the thing until tomorrow. It's okay, become okay to rest and listen to your body so it can take time that it needs to recover, because you need a little more recovery time. And that's okay. That's not your fault. It's just the reality. And actually tomorrow's going to be a much better day if you stop and give yourself a break, if you start to trust your body and what it's capable of. That's actually when your capacity is probably going to expand, is when your body knows that it can trust you to stop when it needs you to, that you actually do.
Mm. I think that's really important. The boundaries of resting when you need to, listening to your body, honoring your body, asking for help. Another one that I think is crucial is saying no.
Yes.
Like, because I want to say yes to everything, because I don't want to disappoint people and I want to be dependable. But it's okay if I say, yes, I can have Christmas at our house, but no, I can't also have Thanksgiving at our house. I can't do both. Or
Yeah.
no, I can't volunteer. For me, this was a big one this year, because last year I tried to volunteer at an after school program for my daughter and I didn't make it every week because of my pain. And
Yeah.
so that caused a lot of mom guilt and all these other things. And I just felt like I was undependable. And, because I can't control when I'm going to have these flares and when I'm actually going to be capable. But basically, I was pushing myself past my capacity in that that 16-week period. So this year I had to say, no, I can't volunteer every week, but yes, I can volunteer the last day of each semester working the prize tables. So that's the boundary I set for myself for this school year. And I didn't feel great yesterday. I happened to do it. I didn't feel great. I was having a pain flare, but I was able to get it accomplished because I had not done all the other things.
Right. Yeah.
And one thing about the capacity, when you're talking about it, I had a lady on my podcast recently, and she has an interesting concept about people with chronic pain and chronic illness and capacity. Just maybe can help with some of the guilt and shame that a lot of us feel. Her perspective is, we with chronic pain and chronic illness don't run at 100% capacity as everybody else or as we used to be. But if we're running at, say, 40% capacity and we're giving 40% capacity, we're giving 100% of what we can give.
Yes.
And that just made me feel so good and so much better about all the times that I can't do everything I want to do, because I know that I really do try my best and I do give, you know, most of the time I give everything I can give, even if it's
Yes.
not 100% of what everybody else can give.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, maybe I can add another thought to that, which would be, when you are honoring yourself and you're honoring your capacity, you're making it okay for your children to do the same. You're actually setting a really good
Mm,
example for them. You're not setting this impossible bar. What you're doing is you're setting a very realistic bar. And also, because I think sometimes people are afraid, like, if my child doesn't see, me pushing myself all the time, they're going to think I'm lazy. Maybe I am lazy. My child's going to be lazy. It's not that. It's not that. It really is honoring your capacity so that, hopefully our children don't get autoimmune disease. Hopefully, Lauren, the way that we're changing our parenting, will change the kind of the scope of health for our children. And at the same time, they're going to get sick. They're going to get the flu, right? They're going to, I hope not, but maybe break a bone sometime or whatever. And like, it's okay for you to let your body heal, for you to give your body
mm,
whatever it needs. And sometimes it's rest and sometimes it's nutrition, right? It can be lots of things. But like, when we're showing our children, again, what I said before about that unconditional self-trust, it's really important for us to have that. But when we have it, what we're doing is we're modeling it for our children. And I think that's hugely, hugely important. So yeah, recognizing that, really acknowledging it's so true. I mean,
mm.
again, most people with autoimmune disease, we kind of turn into people pleasers too, right? And that's a part of that, us creating safety for ourselves, that saying no actually feels really dangerous. We want
Mhm.
to be dependable, yes, but also saying no feels really dangerous. And what I said before about how I thought I was creating safety for myself, we're not creating safety for ourselves when we're pushing our body past its limits, especially when we have autoimmune disease, but for anybody at any time. You're not creating safety for yourself. You're actually creating some danger for yourself,
Mm.
right? When you're not fully listening to your body and giving it what it needs.
No, I agree. What advice do you have for people with chronic, or for specifically for parents with chronic pain and illness, but it could be for people in general too?
What's the advice that I have?
Hmm.
Well, we talked a lot about capacity and really paying attention to it and self trust. I think I think an important piece, and this is going to apply to, being somebody with chronic illness, but just dealing with anything and how we deal with it with ourselves and how we deal with it with our children. And it's disappointment. We
Mm.
experience probably a lot of disappointment as people with chronic illness because there are, like you said, we just don't have the capacity that we used to have or that we wish we had. And the way that we deal with disappointment is really important. It's really, really very important because we can end up dealing with disappointment in a way that leaves us disempowered and like we can never have what we want. Or we can end up learning how to deal with disappointment in a way that actually empowers us and helps us recognize what the reality is. And then again, go ahead and solve for that problem instead of leaving that problem unsolved. And again, the same is true for our kids. We can really teach them how to deal with disappointment. And so I talked a lot about this with people during the pandemic because there were a lot of lockdowns, especially where I was living in Nova Scotia, Canada at the time. The lockdowns were huge, and I was hearing from a lot of people, like my kid's going to miss prom or my kid can't, go see their dad because, their dad works, in a place where he just has to make sure he never gets exposed to COVID or whatever. Right. And so there was like all this disappointment. And typically what we've been taught when somebody's disappointed and they want something they can't have, we usually make it a problem that they want the thing. You don't want that, right? Like you don't want all that sugar. It's just going to give you a tummy ache, right? Well, here's the thing is that our likes and dislikes escalate into to get us to act on our likes and dislikes. So our wants are connected to our likes and dislikes, and our likes and dislikes make up our identity. That means our wants are connected to our identity. So if we make our kids wrong, if we make ourselves wrong for wanting something, that's us stuffing identities again, and we don't want to do that. So the idea is you can validate a want without getting the want. You can validate it for your children. So example I like to use is, say your son comes home from school, he's really upset. Bobby didn't invite him to his birthday party and he really wanted to go. And you can tell this kid's on the verge of tears. He's so upset about it. Mm-hmm. So a lot of us as parents, we will start to get really worried and start to even get a little bit scared. My kid's going to be a crybaby. He's really selfish. He doesn't know how to, like thinking about all these things. And we start to make it a problem that he's upset about not going to the birthday party. Sadly, that's completely disempowering to the child, and it makes it a problem that he's disappointed about something. Instead, what we can do is we can hop in there with language of listening and really validate, first off, how he's feeling, right? So you really wish that you'd gotten that invitation. Look how important this is to you. Even the tears are coming. All of that has to be okay because all of that is just a message. It's just a message about what he likes and what he dislikes. It's a message of who he is, right? But not in that bad way that you have a crybaby or anything like that. Again, tears just show that something's really important to the person. And actually tears are adaptive. They actually help the person move into acceptance so that they can, again, solve the problem, right? This is so important, all of this acceptance. Right? And that idea of accepting our chronic pain that's when we can solve the issue, right? That's when we can move to try to move towards healing. Anyways, back to the idea of the birthday party, again, validating how the child is feeling. And then what is it that he actually wants in that moment? He actually just wants to feel included, right? So and we can say that you just want to feel included. What's another way that you can feel included with your friends on the weekend? Can't go to the birthday party because you're not going to call up that mom and tell her off that her son didn't invite your kid, right? Like that's crossing like boundaries there. But what we can do, is again validate him and then help him find a way to feel connected to his friends on the weekend. And maybe he's going to say, you know what, can the guys come over on Saturday? And that's not going to work for you because actually you have a dinner party planned that night and you don't want a bunch of, kids in your house that are going to mess up your house, right? When you play, especially with chronic illness, right? Like, that's going to be beyond the capacity. And so maybe you can throw something else out there and say, you know what? I can't have a bunch of kids in my house because, those people are coming over for dinner on Saturday. I can drive you guys to the skate park. How about I drive you all to the skate park? I can even pick up your friends if they can't get a drive there, and I'll be there to, to kind of keep an eye on everybody and everything. And, how does that work? And then maybe your kid's happy and he's like, great, or maybe he's like, no, I really want the guys to come over here. Well, maybe then you move it to Sunday after the dinner party has happened, right? So there's all that flexibility wherein, you're helping the child meet their need and not making it about the fact that they're upset about not getting invited to the party, Because disappointment is actually really important, and it's actually a really important life skill, right? There's so many things that we can experience disappointment, right? Losing a game, not getting, asked to the prom by a certain person, not making it on the basketball team, even when you lose a loved one. I mean, there's so much disappointment and grief out there that when we can, validate for our kids and help them solve for that problem. And then, like I said, also doing it for ourselves. And we've talked about that before, right? When it's okay to have reached your capacity, that's when it's okay to go ahead and ask for help, or find a different way to get that thing done.
And I think that's interesting because we're kind of in a society right now where we don't like our kids to feel disappointment. It's like we try to do everything to fix it.
Right. Right. Yeah. And we can't live with the discomfort of it, and you just have to live with the
Hmm.
discomfort of it for a minute. You hold on to that belief. Another example I like to give is, imagine your child comes and asks for a video game system for Christmas, and you've already bought all the gifts, and it's out of the budget and whatnot. Instead of saying it's too expensive, or you can't have that or whatever, what if you just said to the kid, like, oh, all your presents are already bought, or it's out of the budget or whatever, must be some way you can get that video game system. And you just leave it open. You just leave the possibilities open for the child instead of dampening down that want. I live in Canada. We get a lot of snow here. What if that same kid, decides, I got to figure out a way to earn money? Maybe I can go shovel people's driveways. We had two young, really sweet young fellas show up at our door this year. Say, hey, ma'am, can I shovel your driveway? And I'm like, my husband likes to do it because he likes getting the exercise and whatnot. It gets him outside, and I just couldn't resist. Like, I had to go grab my wallet and give these kids some money and just say, like, yeah, sure. Could you, like, I would love it if you did that. I wanted to honor them doing that. But like, these boys have this possibility in their mind. It hasn't been, stuffed down. And so that's the idea. Like, disappointment can actually be really exciting because it's an opportunity to look for new possibilities and really keep, an open mind, and teach your children how to have an open mind as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. So where can we find out more about you and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my business name is Love the Way You Parent. So that's probably the best way to look for me. You can, if you Google it, you should find my website, or just can go straight to my website, which is lovethewayouparent.com. You can find me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook. You can email me at lovethewayouparent@gmail.com. There's lots of ways to kind of connect. And I have a couple of different programs where I work with people. I do specialize in people that had a difficult childhood, teaching them how to use the tools with their children, but also teaching them how to use the tools with themselves in order to reparent themselves, to really,
Mhm.
get to a place where they love the way you parent too. But just my life in general, the way that I just in the world and move through the world is something that I love, so much more than I was able to love in my 20s and 30s as a result of language of listening. Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's been fun. Make sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any health, parenting, and life advice. For my freebie 30 ways to relieve pain without taking a pill, go to ithurtstomom.com/tips. If you have comments, suggestions, or want to be on this podcast, email me at ithurtstomom@gmail.com. I wish everybody a blessed and pain-free day.